Welcome to Behind the Book. It's time now for Behind the Book, hosted by Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion, two authors with a passion for books, no filters, and limitless curiosity. Join them now to find out the real story behind your favorite books and authors. And now, Behind the Book.
Welcome to another episode of Behind the Book. I'm Karen McQuestion. My co-host, USA Today bestselling author Tess Thompson, is out of the studio. So today, I'd like to cover a topic I call 3 things every great novel must have. In this episode, I'll cover what those 3 things are, and for the writers of you out there, I'll give you a few tips that might help with your own fiction writing. But before I delve into the subject at hand, I'll give you a little background. I came up the novel writing ranks with nothing but a great desire and a modicum of talent. Since 3rd grade, I wanted to write books. Besides having a family, it's really the only thing I've ever wanted. For a long time, I was a writer who only thought about writing. And then when my youngest child hit preschool age, I decided to take some time for myself and really pursue it seriously. The problem was that I had no idea how to write a novel. I knew I could string some sentences together, and I had a lot of what I thought were great ideas, but that's where it ended. I joined a local writers group, and I first started out writing personal essays, then eventually brought in pages of what would be my first novel, A Scattered Life. But I really felt like I was writing blind. I was just fumbling through it. I didn't know what I was doing. My writing group was helpful, but it didn't feel like enough. I wanted to know how to write a novel. I wanted the recipe, the nuts and bolts of how a book-length work of fiction was constructed. And so in order to get that information, I read writing books, so many writing books, everything I could get my hands on. I read blog posts and articles. I took some classes locally, attended author events at bookstores, and even raised my hand to ask questions, even though I'm not very outgoing, during the Q&A. All of this helped somewhat, but none of it gave me the definitive answer I was looking for. So finally, I decided to reverse engineer some really outstanding novels, books that I loved, and even those that I didn't love that I knew were very popular, had an enthusiastic following. It's hard to argue with success. What was it about these books that made them stand out? I read them looking for similarities. I jotted down notes. I went into it knowing that novels were as individual as fingerprints, but even fingerprints have commonalities. I thought there had to be something about all these books that appealed to readers on such a great level. And what I discovered was that all the novels I studied shared the same 3 commonalities. The first one was the proficient use of language. The author had a great command of the language and used it well. The second was superior storytelling. And the third one was the books made an emotional connection with the reader. Every single one had all 3 of these components, and they were all done really well. So once I was aware of this, I delved in more deeply, trying to determine what constituted excellence in each area so that I could try to implement it into my own work. The first component, proficient use of language, is, as you can guess, fairly basic, but it's not as easy to achieve as one might think. At least that wasn't the case for me. What I found is that besides the obvious punctuation and grammar, and a really skilled author writes in a way that provides a seamless reading experience. There were a few things that I noticed, which I'll pass along to you now. Sentence structure was critical. A really skilled novelist varies the sentence length. Personally, I read mine aloud to see how it flows. You should try to avoid similar sounding names or those that start with the same letter. I came across some novels that did that I wasn't quite as thrilled with. And when I was confused, it pulled me out of the story. The same thing with word repetition. It's something common with a lot of writers, including myself. I very often will use the same word, even something like the word report. I'll use it as a noun in one paragraph, and then 2 paragraphs later, I'll use it as a verb, and not even realizing I'd done so. It was like a little echoey hiccup issue that I have. So now that's something I really pay attention to and look for before I pass the manuscript off to my beta readers. Another thing that I found that skilled authors do well is dialogue. Now, everyone loves to write dialogue, but some of us overdo it. The author Amy Bloom once said, "Dialogue is not conversation. It is conversation's greatest hits." And what I found is that if dialogue reads in a tedious way, it could probably be eliminated. So if you have two characters who are encountering each other and they exchange some small talk, and then they finally get down to the real issue at hand, it's just fine to write, after exchanging some small talk, Bob got right to the issue at hand. Just skip right over it. This is fiction. It's not real life, and you want to make it interesting. Another thing that beginning writers often don't realize is that the use of cliches is easy to overlook. I try to read over my manuscripts and eliminate them. Occasionally, you see it in dialogue because that's really how we speak. So if you're not familiar with cliches, it would be something as old as the hills, as ugly as sin, white as snow. The little shorthand phrases we use that have been done many, many, many times, and people are familiar with it, which the familiarity makes us think it's a good shortcut. But try not to incorporate them into your fiction writing. The second component found in all great novels, superior storytelling, is more than just the plot, although that plays a huge role. Storytelling begins before you even type word one. Before I start writing a book, I make a point to decide what I call the who, what, and how of my novel. So whose story is it? It's all right to have a big cast of characters in your book, but the reader will probably connect with a book better if they're following along with one or two main characters. Point of view is a deciding factor in a book. I tend to write in third person. She opened the door, as opposed to first person, I opened the door. But it really depends on the author's voice and their style preference. So that's something you should decide. I've also seen more than one point of view in a book, like one chapter in first person and the another in third person. It's your book. You can decide how to do it. I also want to know who my readership is. What genre would this fall in, or what combination of genres? It doesn't have to be slotted into one, but you should have an idea. Now, I've heard writers say, when you ask them who is going to enjoy this book, a beginning writer might say something like, everyone who enjoys a great story, which is what we all hope for. We all think everyone in the world is going to love our book. But chances are it's going to appeal to one readership more than another. And that's something to keep in mind as you're writing. As far as the actual plotting goes, writers are often categorized as plotters and pantsers. And if you're not familiar with that, plotters are the kind that outline ahead of time, and pantsers are those who create the stories they go along. I have often thought that outlining is the most sensible approach, but I've never been able to do it. I've tried multiple times. It seems that once I've done the outline, I have no motivation to finish the story. It turns out that my love of writing stems from discovering the story as I go along, much like a reader would. So I do not outline ahead of time. Whatever you do is exactly right for you. You might do a combination of both. No one can tell you you're wrong. It's like an opinion. It's yours. I do have two plotting books that I can recommend that I found helpful, and there are millions of them out there. But the two that connected with me are The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler and Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. The Writer's Journey is predicated on the idea that all storytelling shares some commonalities or elements, that's what I was looking for, is commonalities. So I love to read over that book, but not as a paint by numbers, follow along, this is how you write. It's just something I use to jumpstart ideas if I'm stuck. Very often I will flip through it when I'm like about 3/4 of the way through a novel. And I'm always surprised by how I've unwittingly incorporated several of Vogler's style elements into my own work. It's just an instinctive thing, something I've done. All of us internalize that. And if you're a storyteller, you should probably trust the process. You know how to tell a story. Save the Cat by Blake Snyder is another excellent one. It's geared towards screenplay writing, but it has some really good thoughts on how stories work. He divides stories up by beats. So that's another one I really liked reading. I don't use it as much for my own personal work, but a lot of people love it and say it's super helpful. Some other tips, there are countless bits of advice out there, but I can share a few that I've found helpful. Don't overwhelm the reader with too many characters initially. I compare it to going to a cocktail party, which is laughable because I don't go to cocktail parties. But if I did, and someone greeted me at the door and took me over to a group of people, 6, 7 people, and introduced me and gave me each their names and how they knew the host, I would find it very overwhelming, wouldn't remember very many of them. I'd want to flee. I mean, that's how it may well read to a reader. There's too many people to keep track of. It's overwhelming, and you don't want to do anything that will cause a reader to close the book and walk away. And you have to remember you have an entire book to introduce these people. So maybe use the first chapter to introduce 1 or 2, maybe 3, but I wouldn't do any more than that, especially if you're a beginning writer, because you're still figuring it all out. Just do the tried and true method and make it easy for yourself and the reader. Another thing that's important in great storytelling is to have a hook at the beginning and throughout. The hook is an unanswered question, something the reader will find intriguing, giving them a reason to read on. So why is your main character out late at night when she's supposed to be home? Why did her grandmother cut her out of the will? Something like that. It doesn't have to be who is the killer. It can be a small thing, but just something that's intriguing. Another thing that people bring up quite often with storytelling is unlikable characters. And I have firsthand knowledge of this because I once wrote a book with an unlikable character. She was actually based a little bit on me, and most people get her, but there were a few readers that did not care for some of the things she did. And I'm not going to go back and change it now, but knowing what I know now, I think it's fine to have an unlikable character, as long as you understand and empathize with their reasons for being unlikable. I look at Ebenezer Scrooge, Scarlett O'Hare, Dexter. There are some great books with unlikable characters. They just have to be well done. We can't hate them. Another thing with great storytelling is the way the timeline is presented. And this is something that a writer, you're the king of that world. You can be a time traveler. Sometimes I give the example of a group of people somewhere in the United States is looking over a treasure map. Somewhere in South America, there's gold buried, and they've got this map. They know exactly where it is. And they figure it out, and the next chapter might open with them getting off the plane in South America. I mean, you don't need to show them packing or discussing the trip or booking their flights. And the reader doesn't care. They just want to know what happens next. And so you've essentially skipped over a big block of time, and it's absolutely just fine. Now, if you wanted to go back again, you could have, say, that same group, same scenario. The last person off the plane is the reluctant friend who didn't think coming was a good idea. And another character could be thinking about how they had to lure him into coming along with them, which is just a flashback. So that's flipping back and forth in time all in one little section of your book. And that's something you can do to keep things heightened and keep the reader's interest. Something that is a maxim that I've read and I've heard in writing classes is show, don't tell. And if you're a writer, you've heard this a million times. They always give the example of if someone's angry, don't say they're angry. Have them slam their fist on the table, have them raise their voice, have them throw something, whatever. Show it. And that's perfectly fine. But this always puzzled me a little bit because sometimes I just really wanted to tell. Sometimes it seemed like a shorthand. And I'm here to tell you that if that's the case for you, I think it's perfectly fine. And I've seen it done by authors who are very accomplished and very successful. You just have to know when to use it. If you're doing it to gloss over tedious detail, it's fine to tell. And an example I might give is if a guy has to be on time for work, his job depends on it or whatever, and he's running late. So he's driving there, his car is stopped by a train, he has other calamities along the way, pulls into his parking space, runs into the building, and it goes from there. If you wanted to, you could just skip to him running into the building and thinking, oh crap, if it wasn't for the train, I'd be on time. Or the receptionist could say, you're late for the meeting. And he could tell her what he encountered. And that's basically telling, which they tell you never to do. But in this case, it's good storytelling. So just maybe that's something to think about as you're writing. Does it make the story better, or is it just laziness? The last component of all great novels is making an emotional connection with the reader. So I came to this conclusion almost as much by reading books that I wasn't crazy about as reading great books. Have you ever read a book that seemed to check off all the boxes? It was well written, engaging plot, terrific characters, but it just didn't grab you for some reason. When that happens, it's often the case that the book didn't make that all-important emotional connection. So as a writer, how do you make that happen? Well, there's a couple different ways. First of all, I found that as human beings, we're conditioned to sympathize with people who are in pain. Not so sociopaths, of course, but the majority of us. So it helps to have a main character who's suffering in some way. Physical pain is an obvious choice, but it doesn't have to be that dramatic. Even loneliness will elicit a response. Something to keep in mind is, what is troubling your main character? What is their problem? What is causing them pain, either physical or emotional? And then once you've decided that, if your character experiences something traumatic, it's important to give that event enough space on the page. The author should not only relate what happened, but also incorporate the character's emotional and physical responses, along with the thought process that the character is going through. The combination of all of those things drives the event home for the reader, who feels as if they are there living the situation through the character. Readers want the whole experience: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Most beginning writers do an excellent job with sight and sound. I mean, we're all about describing the room, doing the dialogue, but it's very common that they forget the other senses. My rule of thumb for myself is to make sure every scene has at least one additional sense besides sight and sound. And it doesn't have to be hugely descriptive. If the character is drinking lemonade and it's refreshing, that's enough. I don't have to go into detail about how sour it is or if there's pulp or not. Most readers have had lemonade and they will bring their own experience to it. Another way to make an emotional connection is through tension. When a scene is infused with tension, that's when you get that edge of your seat reading experience that everyone loves. Tension is something that's talked about a lot in writing classes. I used to get it confused with conflict, and the two can be connected, but they aren't the same thing. Very often, tension is not knowing. Sometimes the reader knows of a danger or consequence, but the character doesn't, which provides a lot of tension. You see that a lot in horror movies. Other times, the reader only knows as much as the character does. And so you're following along as they open the locked door to the room they've been warned never to go into, or confront someone who's threatened to kill them. And that's tension right there. You want to see how it plays out. You know how difficult a situation this is for the character. So to recap, the three things found in all great novels are proficient use of language, superior storytelling, and making an emotional connection with the reader. I hope you found this episode helpful. Until next time, take care and be well.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Book, brought to you by authors Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion. They hope you found it entertaining and informative. If you loved it, tell your friends. And if you have a moment, they'd love for you to post a star rating or review. This has been Behind the Book.